All right, part two, the deep state. So we just talked about the history of the deep state and what it means to have these faceless bureaucrats sitting in low, medium positions within the government. Some of them in other positions higher up, still not known or elected or accountable to American people, who have power over aspects of our lives that we may not even recognize. Um, and we have no control of them whatsoever. Even if we could figure out who they were, we could do nothing about it because they weren't elected. And nowhere in the Constitution does it say there shall be a department of X, Y, and Z appointed by the president and whose employees would be handpicked by the appointee of the president and can be as deep and have as many employees in it as deemed necessary by the people running that department. There's nothing like that in the Constitution even to this day. Administrative government is about as unconstitutional a thing as you can imagine. Of course, that very thing, the administrative government, is why the government is so bloated, why it's so big, why it's so centralized, and why it's so out of control. Thanks, Woodrow. And of course, this is the very thing that the progressives and the liberals and now basically all Democrats love about the government, is because there's so many departments with so many people. I think there's something like I don't know. There's thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people who work for the government, more than ever before. And you know, the suburbs around Washington D.C. over the years the populations have skyrocketed, especially under liberal administrations like Obama. I mean, the city of Arlington and surrounding neighborhoods in Maryland and whatnot. These neighborhoods and these towns have exploded in population, filled with deep state operatives working for the U.S. government in the constant attempt to make government more centralized and bigger and bigger and bigger. There are people who used to think of the government as a job that was for a few elite people. The government was something that you would, give some service to and maybe then go on and do something else. The old idea of the citizen politician. There was some people who wanted to get a good start in life in their careers by working in the government as an intern or as this or that, and then they go on and do some other real work in the real world under the laws that they helped craft or support the people who crafted them. But now it has become a career job. And not only just a career job, but a job sought out by people who have an agenda and who want to save the world. And as I mentioned in previous videos, the hubris of the left actually believes that somehow, with their minor contribution, sitting at a desk in a large office building in Washington, D.C., or what have you, is somehow going to help the world because they were there when it all happened and went down. It's amazing. But there are these people who actually believe that they're helping instead of just being a cog in the wheel that just spins but produces nothing. The waste, the superfluousness of the deep state in Washington that produces $1 million hammers and toilet seats and studies unnecessary things that could be studied by lower level, state level, municipal level places in the country and have no business being at the federal level. It is numerous. It is exhaustive. It is really, if people really knew just how crazy it is, they would stand up and start, light the torches and attack the castle. It's too deep and expansive to even try to articulate properly. Because over the last number of decades, and especially in the last 4 or 5 decades, the administrative state, as the United States now can consider the government, it's no longer a true federal government, because the federal government has taken all the work that was supposed to be given to the states and the municipalities onto themselves. It's no longer a true republic, because there's so many people who are unelected by the people in the government. By far more people are unelected than are elected, by probably a factor of 10 or 20 or something. It's no longer a constitutional government purely, to the extent that the Constitution nowadays, by both executives like Obama and in recent memory, and by leaders in the Congress that decide to ignore the Constitution, and maybe most especially by certain judges who decide that they're going to legislate from the bench instead of being a judge in the judicial system. They're going to be a legislator from the legislative branch, sitting on a bench, and thwart the Constitution or ignore it altogether. Way more today than it's ever been done, on many more levels, and many more troublesome results coming from that. So, what the hell are we? What happened to the constitutional republic that believed in federalism, that existed prior to the progressive movement in the late 19th century? It is gone, and may never come back. To which liberals and progressives are going, well, yay, but guess what? You think we're better off now? You think things are going better now? You think that this is working? Think again, because it ain't working. And it ain't working because we didn't have it wrong, and as I mentioned in previous videos, the only reason these things have been changed is because people couldn't deal with not changing things. They had to put their paws on it and manipulate it for their own purposes and their own agendas. They couldn't help themselves. There was a socialist utopia awaiting them out there in some hopefully near future, and that could not be achieved with a constitutional republic that believed in federalism. It just couldn't. So it had to start eating away at it. And of course, like all things that are liberal, it destroys, it does not create. In order to make things equal, everybody equal, they have to destroy the good, and destroy the successful, and destroy the rich, and destroy the smart, and make everything mediocre. They never lift up, they always tear down. And they did that with the government too. They took a perfectly well-functioning government that only needed a tweak here and there, and needed a few laws to be actually enforced here and there, and everything would have been just fine. Thank you very much. But no, we had to change it all. We had to manipulate it. We had to force a square peg into a round hole, whatever, and here we are. Not constitutional, not federal, not republic. I don't know what the hell we are. And unless we try to get back to it, we're in trouble. We're never going to get back to it unless we start cleaning up the deep state, which now has a nice little nickname, the Swamp. Nothing could be more apropos than the nickname of Washington, D.C., or the federal government at this point in history than calling it the Swamp. Both historically, because Washington, D.C. was built on a swamp, one, and two, because the swamp rats that occupy it are down deep in the muck and nobody can see them, let alone catch them and get rid of them. There are more people in government than ever. There are more departments in government than ever. There are more people unaccountable, unelected, and unknown than ever. And these people, over the history of the last 100 years, have also morphed and changed themselves. When they were first put into these positions, they were probably patriotic. They were probably thinking that they would be doing some good without an agenda per se. They were just looking for a job. Many of those jobs were welcome during the Depression. But then they stayed. They didn't go anywhere. And they got more powerful. And they had to weigh their patriotism and their constitution, and they had to weigh the desires of the current administration, whoever that was, against their own, filters and biases and whatnot. And for the most part, they did the right thing, the right time. And as deep as the state got and the government got, and as much, the many more people that came about, adding to the power of government, and the more centralized it got, for the most part, until probably 1970s, these people did their job. They did it as they saw it was the right thing to do. They followed the rules for the most part, with some minor exceptions. And, despite the fact government was getting out of control, at least it was peopled by folks with some integrity. And then something happened. As I mentioned in my last video and many other videos, the hippies came to town. Remember, I mentioned that when the hippies were done with their sit-ins and marches and picketing and whatnot at college and around town during the 1960s, and they grew up and had to get a job and enter the real world, many of them decided to continue the fight in ways that they thought would be productive and constructive. They would enter into the judiciary, they would enter into politics, they would enter into academia, and they would enter into Hollywood and the surrounding supportive jobs of all that. And they would continue with their revolution and their influence in more positions of wealth and power. And as regard to politics, not all of them just ran for office. Many of them decided to become deep state operatives, figuring that if they were elected, their term would come up, or they'd have to keep getting elected. And then many of them didn't figure that their socialist agenda might actually work, and maybe couldn't get elected if they were to be honest with the people they were trying to have vote for them. Dogs. So they decide not to go into elective office, but to go into government from behind the scenes. And then we have the deep state, which always existed, but now exists in a much more insidious way, filled with people with agendas, and filled with people who have a plan, and filled with people who are working behind the scenes, possibly even against or the current administration. People who would not necessarily even have to leave when an administration turned over. Remember, many of the people who went into government in unelected fields, even before the 70s, remained in government for longer and longer periods of time. Some of them worked for Eisenhower, and then they worked for Kennedy, and then they worked for Johnson, and then they worked for Nixon, and then they retired. And of course, later after that, they would work for multiple, subsequent presidents as well, who was at the top didn't really matter. And it's the more liberal they got and the more insidious their nature, the less it mattered. In fact, the goal was to actually help with the Democrat president and then perhaps help thwart the Republican president. But they didn't have the power and they didn't have the numbers in the 70s. They were filling the coffers in the 70s. It wasn't until the time of Reagan when they had enough bodies, enough people on the same, thinking the same way, that they could actually do anything to undermine a president. And that's when it all started, truly. The deep state, the swamp rats, the liberals who invaded Washington, D.C. and far, far, far outnumbered any independents or right-wingers that might have wanted to take up the unelected jobs within the U.S. government. Knew each other, grouped together, like, same species herding together, and decided together in many ways to how they were going to help whatever Democrat president was coming up and hurt whatever Republican president was in charge. And now they have the power to do it. And God knows what kind of messes they made doing that very thing. Whether it was, Deep Throat during Watergate, for instance, who might have been a whistleblower and might have been, thinking he's helping his country. But make no mistake, deep state operatives like that, weren't always doing the right thing for the right reasons. Once they realized they had the power, like a Deep Throat maybe, to do things like that, they started to get full of themselves and thinking, hey, we can do more. We can obtain more power. And in the next part, we'll start talking about how they did that very thing, obtaining the power it takes to alter the government in ways that had never been designed to be altered. All right, see you in part 3.